a different notion of how some of these how fusion and music and how media can offer a new location for field work and for studying for the social sciences. So from New York to Rio, from Nairobi to Tokyo, hip-hop, more than any musical genre or youth culture in the world, has permeated different nations, different cultures, different languages worldwide. Hip-hop blossoms from the New York City fiscal crisis of the 1970s, and it flourishes under grim conditions as a vibrant expression of youthful exuberance used to overcome repression, marginality, discrimination, and hardship. 4 means of expression or elements define hip-hop's lyrical, physical, auditory codes. Breakdancing today is an acrobatic phenomenon in Japan, and we can consider it a physical language or a physical code. DJing in Germany, DJs in Germany have not only turned the record player into its own musical instrument, but it has its own musical notation style. Graffiti art, from walls to skin to tattoos. In South Africa, muralists have accentuated the potential of the spray can as a paintbrush. Right? And perhaps the most well-known element of hip-hop, rap, right? Which has been perhaps the most commodified, the most commercialized, the most that's entered the market, the global market. We can talk about rap flow in Swahili. So this is no longer an American art movement. This is by this point, it is completely a global movement when we talk about hip-hop. So in many cases, the globalization of hip-hop developed somewhere between play and rewind, where media reproduction and imitation played an essential role in its reinvention and its acculturation abroad. So for this reason, I explore media as an avenue to explore hip-hop. Now, when we talk about hip-hop, we talk about these 4 elements. And these are elements. Some groups talk about the 5th element of knowledge. I also like to, when I talk about this series of codes, right, or these types of codes, think about hip-hop value systems. Because there are value systems inherent in hip-hop that aren't as clear as these elements. And these include everything from competition, battling, hierarchies, reciprocity, different value systems that I think are perhaps more useful for us in looking at hip-hop as a culture, or looking at how hip-hop has permeated so many cultures worldwide through and associated by a set of values, perhaps more so than just a set of elements. In Cuba, for example, it's nearly impossible to get spray paint. You couldn't get a turntable if you tried, and if you did, it was one of those old Russian ones that you really didn't have a needle anymore. So many things where material goods were no longer defining what hip-hop was. So it became actually the first time I saw a DJ in Cuba, he wrapped a sponge around a microphone and rubbed it against a mirror to create the squeaky, squeaky, squeaky. So it became this idea of recreating it by any means necessary, right, the audio. So a few places remain isolated from one another in the musical landscape of the Caribbean. A very unique case is Cuba and Puerto Rico. Although the 2 islands share common colonial histories, today they hold polarized relationships with the United States, the birthplace of hip-hop. Each island showcases a vibrant musical scene and a thriving urban culture, yet each maintains sharply contrasting cultural and economic infrastructures since the inception of Cuba's revolution in 1959. Despite Puerto Rico's geographical proximity to Cuba, it is a U.S. territory, bound by the U.S. embargo and travel ban regulations, thereby isolating hip-hop between islands as well as its interpreters. So my question, one of my fieldwork questions became, if given the chance, despite the obvious political barriers and using hip-hop as a platform and audiovisual production as a method, under what terms might isolated communities coincide? Rappers armed with rhymes and personal narratives of struggle have interwoven political and geographic distances, leaving behind isolation as a relic of the past that no longer belongs to their generation. The songs Son Dos Alas by Anónimo Consejo and Tego Calderón, Guasábara by 7-9 and Maya Lopez, Sin Permiso by Los Aldeanos and Intifada, and Sangre Guerrera by El B and 7-9 make up the primary data of my research, which took 6 years to produce from 2004 to 2010. Local rappers from both Cuba and Puerto Rico used their voices, and I provided the media platform. Together we created dialogues that identified with the global generation. Where rappers may be minorities in their own local context, they became majorities on a global scale. These songs and music videos mark the first contemporary rap collaborations between islands recorded each in its respective local context. Seen as anthropological data, the songs reveal that it is through value systems and common civil rights struggles more so than the strictly four elements of hip-hop, being rap, breakdance, turntablism, and visual art, that youth relate to one another and their global audiences. This isn't just a multimedia story about rappers from two islands. It's also my story, learning to navigate my discipline, while conducting research between communities who are geographically and politically isolated from one another. Communities whose nations have not had diplomatic relations in over 50 years. So in order to understand the ethnomusical value of this bridge, I think it's important that we look back at the last 100 years of musical bridges, or post-colonial fusions between Cuba and Puerto Rico. The New World post-colonial criollo identity of the Caribbean has been historically identified with the genre known as son. During the early 20th century, the most popular platform for the public performance of son was through teatro bufo, or bufo theater. This theater performance style consisted of satirical political commentary emphasizing three main figures: the black African, the white European, and the criollo mulatto. These characters exchanged ideologies with respect to racial hierarchies, national agendas, and the tensions between rural and urban identities. It also offered avenues of exchange between playwrights, actors, and musicians from Cuba and Puerto Rico. Theater, bufo theater, created an artistic platform for performances that encouraged musical experimentation between the islands and led to the fusions of son guajira, son guaracha, and son montuno. Half a century later, the Cuban composer Benny Moré internationalized the son while on tour in Puerto Rico. He gave the singer-songwriter Ismael Rivera, who utilized the son to reaffirm the African roots of the working class struggle on the island, the nickname El Sonero Mayor, where Ismael Rivera is known for bringing son into the American big band. Benny Moré was known for bringing the son into fusions throughout Latin America. Midway through the 20th century, both islands suffered a massive migration towards New York and Miami. At the root of the musical experiments presented by Moré, can you see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
No?
I can't see it.
You can't see it? Just see if we hit the light, maybe I... How does that work? Yeah, that's okay. That's fine. I can still read, as long as I don't run into anything. At the root of the musical experiments presented by Moré and Rivera, the son blended with jazz in the U.S. mainland. Musicians such as Marcelino Guerra, Machito, Chano Pozo, and Arsenio Rodriguez were amongst the pioneers who allied son to American jazz and big bands, such as the Benny Goodman, the Glenn Miller, and the Artie Shaw bands. These fusions symbolize an auditory experience reflective of the Cuban and Puerto Rican migration to the United States. For the purposes of framing Between Play and Rewind, the migration from the island to the United States formed a second musical bridge that rejoined Cuba and Puerto Rico. But rather than between islands, this bridge was formed by a shared diaspora. Caribbean migration greatly influenced the early development of hip-hop during the post-civil rights era. As exhibited by the works of Flores, Chang, and Rivera, the racial, cultural, and political social setting allowed for the unification of a generation under new musical terms. Today, there are two types of Puerto Rican influences in hip-hop, one forged by Puerto Ricans in New York, also referred to as New Yorican, and the other from rappers on the island. Mainland rappers represent the Puerto Rican identity in a very different context than their island counterparts. Similarly, hip-hop is younger than the U.S. embargo against Cuba, thereby restricting it from direct influences by U.S. art movements. For this reason, it is essential to distinguish between the hip-hop created by Miami Cubans and that by Cuban rappers on the island. Rappers from Miami, although faithful to their ethnic and cultural roots, developed their musical careers under radically different contexts than those on the island. Therefore, when I refer to Cuban rap or Puerto Rican rap, for the purposes of Son Dos Alas, I refer only to rap produced within each island as a geographical space. But that space also implies a social, political, historic, and economic arena. Son Dos Alas proposes the study of the same musical movement of hip-hop that was birthed and flourished in the United States, but only sought to unite its protagonists within each island, intentionally excluding the U.S. cradle of rap. So before we head between locations and into our media, I think we should take a pause. Documentary filmmaking and anthropology expanded together in the first half of the 20th century. Russian filmmaker Dziga Vertov and French anthropologist Gilles Rouche labeled cinema verite as provoking audiences to promote social change through realistic documentation laced with scripted camera work and editing. Mead collaborated with Bateson towards incorporating visual imagery as the basis for their ethnographies, and suggested that anthropology was a discipline beyond mere words, arguing that it was insufficient for ethnographers to only use pencil and paper as their instruments. Perhaps the most contemporary and most well-respected works on the use of media in anthropology today comes from Media World, the edited compilation by Ginsberg, Abuda, and Larkin. The work shows us how media can be used as a method for cultural preservation or as an archive, how it can be used towards activism and advocacy, and how it can be applied for analysis and interpretation. The fieldwork methodology of my doctoral research began to get built upon Boas and Herskovit's relativist approach towards the construction of knowledge that proposes social research as a constant interplay between experiences, fieldwork, and ideas, theory. Both are to be developed under the terms of the participants. Through the use of audiovisual production, my research aimed to amplify the interpretive approach credited to Geertz, called thick description, that proposes the ethnographic text creates culture through a series of symbols and codes. Between Play and Rewind proposes a similar approach as attributed to Moss and to Clifford, by which ethnographies construct culture, but in this case, using the microphone and the camera as complementary instruments to the text. For the purposes of my research, I utilized a participatory action method stemming from the action research of Lewin and the critical pedagogy of Freire, in which I studied with rather than on subjects. This collaborative method between researcher and subject allowed us both to learn together. Each song and music video became a place built by a team of researchers and subjects together as co-producers and co-protagonists, also as co-investigators and co-subjects, with everyone feeding in their expectations and goals. Because let's be honest, when an anthropologist studies a community, that community also examines the anthropologist. If we honor the creative and communal construction of knowledge, we can create something together, and we can celebrate that with collaborative fieldwork. In the construction of Son Dos Alas, I applied Falls Borda's approach of community action. Such a method democratizes knowledge-making and grounds it in everyday community needs, converting research subjects into fellow co-investigators. Falls Borda's method became a progenitor of participatory action research, which aims to serve purposes beyond the creation and subsequent monopolization of knowledge. And lastly, I exercised Antonio Gramsci's concept of organic intellectuals. As such, every co-investigator was treated as an intellectual that offered unique insight towards the creation, content, and production of each song and music video. So with this milieu of theories, I created what I titled Participatory Ethnographic Production. What does that mean? That means that we work together as a team as co-investigators, where I provided the technological resources, some of the publication platforms, because again, we co-publish much of the work. I gave creative input as much as co-investigators gave creative input. I also allowed the work to have an educational component, because many of the communities that I was working with didn't know how to work a camera, didn't know how to download, didn't know how to work a hard drive. So you can't just donate equipment, you also need to show people how to use it, right? So I created an educational component, which was also a means for me to navigate the field and build relationships. And I donated used technology that I acquired from different recording studios in the United States to both locations. So this is the participatory ethnographic production sort of outline grid table for Son Dos Alas, the song you just heard. And again, I developed this a little bit further a little later on, but what I think is important about this work is one important aspect of participatory ethnographic production is the mutual consent, is the co-publication, and the co-copyrights. So the research data, made up of songs and music videos, were constructed together between artists and myself. Where they placed their talent, I placed the production resources, and we mutually designed the themes and imagery that would make up the songs and music videos. In turn, working together, artists consented to the representation and the use of their voice and image, as I consented to the use of the recordings and video montages for their own purposes. In this process, I discovered that the research became relevant to rappers when we mutually created a tangible product that was applicable to my research as well as for their presentation kits, because the community I was going to work with and I was working with needed music videos. They needed songs for their albums. They didn't have recordings, right? So this is what became relevant to them. And it was in this way that the camera and the microphone became active agents in the field. When successful, the method envelopes these other issues that anthropologists, documentary filmmakers, and artists face in collaborative work, such as ethics, informed consent, shared intellectual property, and co-copyrights. It also allows for co-publication and distribution, because let's be honest, who reads a dissertation? My advisor used to tell me 2.5 people read a dissertation. And I was always curious who was that 0.5, exactly, right?
Your advisor.
Well, we have to go through that rite of passage, and it's an important rite of passage. I'm not minimizing it. But we do write a dissertation for a committee of approximately 5 people. I mean, that's pretty well known, right? So what I felt I was able to do with this work was by having co-authorship, co-publication, co-distribution with the artist, I was able to reach greater audiences, which, in turn, when we look at the numbers, this is from YouTube visits of the music videos and the songs in the first year of their publication, okay? The first year that it came out. So this would be Son dos Alas, 1 year in 2006, Wasabara 1 year in 2007, so I could have a rather, isolate the variables a little bit more. When we look at this, I mean, we're seeing 250,000 views, or access to, or approximation, you know, to the work, right? To the doctoral work, which is much more than 5 or 2.5 people, right? But I felt like this method, participatory ethnographic production, allowed for wider audiences to interact with the fieldwork data, with the researchers, the subjects, collaborators, co-investigators. So perhaps someone didn't know who Anónimo Consejo was, but they knew who Tego Calderón was, right? So it amplified mutually their audiences, and it also allowed them, and then they said, wait a minute, this song is part of a dissertation? A dissertation in what? So it allowed a greater interaction with the discipline, right? So in my case, anthropology. But I think that this method could be applied to other social science disciplines as well. So as well, I'll talk a little bit about navigating the field here, but there was some other music videos that I did to navigate the field, and these were all some of the other songs that we're not going to look at. We will look at Los Pelos. But when we look at the total views, we're reaching almost 750,000 people saw this material. Way beyond, right? But this has to do, way beyond what maybe one individual with a dissertation, right? But this has to do with the co-publication, okay? Because I used the songs, all 4 songs for my dissertation, for multimedia journal articles, popular culture magazines, YouTube, lectures like this, right? But so Tego Calderón also used it. And he published a piece of it in, a piece of the song Son dos Alas with Atlantic Records. Anónimo Consejo published it in their album. 7-9 published Wasabara in his album. Los Aldeanos published Sin Permiso in their album, and so on, and so on. So having the co-publication and the co-copyrights with my co-investigators was critical in the methodology and making the work relevant to them. So now we'll fast forward. I constructed my fieldwork between Havana and San Juan for 6 years from 2004 to 2010. The early stages of my research consisted of preliminary interviews with rappers. But in the process of conducting interviews, I discovered that my way of framing questions interfered with my ability to retrieve authentic answers. No matter how I positioned a question, my background, my privileged access to both locations, often influenced how artists responded in order to either meet my expectations or address their own agendas. To overcome the limitation I experienced with asking artists to respond on their own terms. What were their topics of interest? When I said Cuba and Puerto Rico, what did they think about? When I said, Cuba, what are you dealing with? Puerto Rico, what are you dealing with? What's on your mind? If you could have a music video about whatever you want, which song would we do a music video of? All of a sudden, I started to learn that the rappers were much more articulate about what were their terms through rap. Using this method, I produced a series of experimental songs and music videos that served both my own research as much as artist presentation kits. I discovered that artists were more articulate and focused on the issues that most mattered to them when manifested through the microphone and the lens. And this allowed me to navigate the field and learn participants' topics of interest as they saw them. I'm going to show you now one of these videos that was done to navigate the field for a rap duo called Obsesión, and the video is called Los Pelos. This video is the only one in this collection that does not have subtitles, so I apologize for that in advance. But just to give you a summary of what you're going to see, it's a short video, it's about 3.5 minutes. It celebrates the beauty of black hair. It's called The Hairs, Los Pelos. And the chorus says, may, up with the hair, may the dreadlocks grow. And one of the scenes in the song, Mahia, the female rapper and protagonist of the video, says, and as I walk down the street, I see a sea of stores, but none of them have a black doll that looks like me. And so we spent a large part of the video trying to find a black doll to have her put in the camera saying, you know, I have mine, do you have yours? With that sort of posture, but we never found one. The only dolls we could find were figures of Santeria, or they were dolls with fruit baskets on their head, and we couldn't find just a black doll. So you'll see with the video how we decided to paint it.